Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Granada Forum. I'm here to introduce our speaker for tonight, who is Mike Ruppert. And are we being told everything about the impeachment story now unfolding in Washington, D.C.? Our guest speaker for this evening, Mike Ruppert, a former LAPD narcotics investigator and longtime critic of alleged CIA drug dealing, says we are not. How are the CIA, the drugs, and the impeachment of Bill Clinton connected? This evening we'll find out. We'd also like to suggest for supplemental information, you might want to pick up Mike's newsletter, which is called From the Wilderness. It's on the back table, which is widely read by both conservatives and liberals. How about that? Now, without further delay, please join me in a nice welcome for Mike Ruppert. Fire away, Mike.
Thank you very much, Ann and Dennis, and Ralph's not here. I'd like to thank you all. You all are always so extremely courteous and very gracious, and it's always a pleasure to be here. The last time I was here, I was just thinking about it, was 2 years ago in about 2 weeks, so it's just been about 2 years. For those of you who don't know, I can tell you about my one brightest moment in world history so far. You might remember that November 15th, 1996, down at Locke High School in South Central, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency came down to feel the outrage, so to speak, of a lot of people over allegations that CIA was dealing drugs, and they had a fairly controlled, fairly out-of-control town hall meeting. And during the course of that meeting, a guy was called on and stood up and said, I am a former LAPD narcotics detective. I worked South Central Los Angeles, and I can tell you, Director Deutsch, emphatically and without equivocation, that the agency has dealt drugs in this country for a long time. And that was me. Now, I got bullet holes in this arm, and I got burns, over third-degree burns, and I've been, I've been around, and but I got to tell you that was truly the scariest moment of my life. But there was a higher power, there was a hand of something that gave me the words when I needed them, and I was able to tell Director Deutsch that I knew very well about 3 agency operations, known as Amadeus, Pegasus, and Watchtower, and that I had been trying then for 18 plus years, I'm now in my 21st year, to expose the CIA's involvement in drug trafficking. And if you watch John Deutsch respond, he kind of went, well, if you have such information, you should go to the Los Angeles Police Department, which was very funny. I have oral history tapes. I was privileged in '97, the history department at UCLA, my alma mater, recorded a 3-hour oral history of my life with Professor James Wilkie, 40 graduate students and 80 undergraduates, where they asked me questions like I was a PhD candidate, so to speak, and also got my history and put it on tape. And I have the whole confrontation with John Deutsch, which is on that tape. Tim, back in the back there, wave your hands, Tim, has got him. Don't hold it against Tim. He's a former Green Beret, like a great many of my friends. And I salute all the former Special Forces guys who I have been privileged to know and who still provide me with information on a regular basis, because they have proven that there is such a thing as honor and that it is alive. No matter what price some people pay for it. I was talking to some people in the back, and I promise you, for those of you who are like really wanting to hear this $90 million punchline I have about the impeachment, I will not let you down. But I do have to set some stages here. We were talking, I've been talking to many of you in the back before the show started. We were talking about my newsletter. And they said, do you know so-and-so, and do you know so-and-so? And I go, well, yeah, he subscribes to my newsletter. Well, yeah, he subscribes to my newsletter. And I was thinking that in the 2 years since I've been here, 2 years ago, I was stone broke, didn't have a car, as I've been for most of the last 21 years. You don't make a lot of money fighting CIA. I was freshly divorced, and now I'm still pretty much stone broke. I still live and work in one room, don't own a bed, I'll sleep on a futon. But I was thinking about where I've come and where the grace of my God has brought me, and I have this newsletter now that's, the 11th issue is coming out, and I was thinking about the names of some of the subscribers might be familiar to you. Terry Reed, Mark Phillips, Kathy O'Brien, Bob Fletcher, Mike Levine, Celerino Castillo, Gary Webb, Bob Perry, former AP reporter, Professor Alfred McCoy, who wrote the book Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, Maxine Waters, don't hold it against me. Bill, listen, I got to tell you, Maxine Waters has been a little weird, and hard to fathom on the Clinton issue, but on the CIA drug issue, she has been great, and she has my support on that, and we'll talk about that. Former FBI agent Bill Turner, who's written a great many bestsellers, including The Fish is Red. John Christian, who wrote a great book on the Bobby Kennedy assassination. Lou Epton, our deserted talk show host Peter Ford. April Oliver. I've been doing a lot of stuff recently with April Oliver, who was the CNN producer who did the sarin gas stories, and she and I have become very good friends. And there's a new term in journalism these days: if you tell the truth, you'll get the April Oliver treatment. But we can get into that later. So I've come a long way, and I've been very fortunate, been blessed. I've worked very hard. And there's no way to tell you what I want to tell you tonight without telling you who I am. Unfortunately, stories don't get real, and it's a lesson that I think Gary Webb taught us, and it's a lesson that was taught to us by Harriet Beecher Stowe when she wrote a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin, that you don't really understand what something is until you see it through the eyes of one individual going through it. So I have to tell you a little bit about me so you can see the perspective that I come from. My mother, God bless her, was a cryptographer for the Army Security Agency and later the National Security Agency. She was working and assigned on Cordell Hull's mission to Moscow in 1943. She worked for NSA up through 1949. My father was an Air Force officer who left the Air Force after the Korean War, went to work for Martin Marietta, and worked on many or most CIA's boosters for spy satellites, specifically the Titan 3C. Relatives of my father, Sam and Barbara, his cousins, who are also my cousins, obviously. Sam was career OSS and retired from CIA, and his wife Barbara is retired from CIA, so I come from a spook family. I am also part of a 12-step recovery program. We have a saying, you're as sick as you are secret, and boy, was mine a sick family. I can tell you that right now. That's kind of a joke, but I had a Q clearance when I was 14, only because I lived in the same house with my father and his briefcase and the work that he did. We moved to California, 67. I went to UCLA, and I knew as far back as 1968 that I wanted to be an LA policeman. I didn't want anything else. Went to UCLA, was an honor student in political science. I was on the law enforcement education program run by LEAA, which was staffed by a lot of former CIA officers, a lot of career CIA people in there, where they picked the best and the brightest. My closest friend was a guy by the name of Craig Fuller. Craig and I were both in the public service program. I was interning for LAPD, working Venice Division, Rampart, Wilshire Detectives. Then all of a sudden, Craig was chosen to intern for Governor Ronald Reagan, and I was chosen to intern for LAPD Chief Ed Davis. Craig Fuller, for those of you who don't know, was Chief of Staff to George Bush during Iran-Contra. He's also now, he is the chief lobbyist for Philip Morris. He's got a lot more money than I do. Anyway, in my senior year at UCLA, my family bought me a ticket. I was sent back to Washington, D.C. I stayed with my aunt and uncle in Bethesda, went down to the old EOB, the Executive Office Building, and a CIA officer with the big seal behind his head gave me the recruitment pitch, and they said, Mike, when you graduate from UCLA, what we would like for you to do is to become a case officer, which in the agency is the highest level on the food chain. And then we would like, after you are a case officer, to put you back through the Los Angeles Police Academy, and that will be your cover. Now, that's illegal, in case you don't know. CIA is not supposed to do that inside the U.S. I thought that they were going to make me James Bond and send me to Paris so that I could, have sexy women and, do fun things. And that was not, I never sent the papers back. It just, I wanted to be a cop, and I really did, and I was. So I went through the LA Police Academy, was valedictorian for 3 classes in 1973. Was assigned to Wilshire Division when Wilshire had an area called the Jungle, which, for those of you who know it, is now Martin Luther King. It was Santa Barbara Avenue in those days, and Crenshaw. I was in 2 shootings. I specialized in narcotics, was promoting rapidly, and then one day I met and fell in love with a female CIA agent, and I'll tell you that that was a slightly different recruitment process, but she was trying to recruit me. and I fell madly in love with her. But what I heard over a period of time was her describing trips to Hawaii, and she'd come back from Hawaii and say, I was in a room with 50 kilos of cocaine and 1,000 M16s. My attitude was, if I'm ever in a room with 50 kilos of cocaine, this is 1976, somebody's going to jail, and it's not going to be me. I would not overlook drugs. She would talk about such activities in Baja California. She would talk about such activities in Texas, in the Bahamas, and in New Orleans, especially New Orleans. She knew organized crime people. She also knew very high-ranking people in LAPD's Organized Crime Intelligence Division, including a guy named Lee Goforth, who was a brigadier general in the California Guard, and who I have written much about, and they all can sue me anytime they want to. I publish, and so I'm open to suits, and nobody has decided to do that yet. So she would tell me that her people were interested in having me go to work, and I learned about this outfit called NIN, the Narcotics Intelligence Network, where if I'm a narcotics detective, let's say I'm LAPD and you're DEA, and I'm investigating this major organization, and I've got a snitch that I've just developed who can go make a buy in that organization, but you've got an undercover who's been there for a year, and you're developing a major case. You have to have this clearinghouse so that I can enter the names and make sure that if I go in and do something, I'm not going to arrest your undercover guy. That's NIN. Well, that's where CIA penetrates all their drug operations to protect their drug operations inside the U.S. Gary Webb wrote about it in his book, but I told a lot of people about it. I've been saying that for 20 years. As I kept saying I would not get involved in anything that overlooked drugs, she eventually left. I wound up on an unofficial loan to Organized Crime Intelligence Division working with Lee Goforth and his partner Norm Bonneau. And there was another guy named John Xavier Vach, V-A-C-H, who later became Daryl Gates' driver bodyguard. Parenthetically, in April 1985, John Xavier Vach was convicted of moonlighting for the Central Intelligence Agency on city time, using wiretaps and turning all the proceeds of the wiretaps, the bugging, over to CIA. He had a 6-month suspension and was sentenced to a year probation, and this was the man who was sitting right next to Daryl for 4 years, driving him everywhere he went. I forced myself into a vacation in the summer of 1977 because Teddy was in New Orleans. I had to straighten this out with her. I had to get it over with. We had property we had to settle, and I get down to New Orleans, and she's got a KY3 scrambler phone in her apartment. She has a black night vision device. She's getting sealed communiques from Naval and Air Force NCOs assigned to Belle Chase Naval Air Station. And she's arranging for large quantities of guns to be loaded onto ships owned by a company called Brown and Root, which are leaving for Iran, and they're going to be smuggled through Iran. I didn't know this at the time. I found out later, to arm the Kurds to fight Saddam Hussein. Now, parenthetically, Richard Helms, former DCI, was the ambassador to Iran. Richard Secord was the air advisor to the Shah of Iran. All the same names we know from Iran-Contra after, and all the people we know from Vietnam and Laos from before were all involved in this operation in Iran. It's the same people all along. She's arranging for the guns to leave, and she's arranging for large quantities of heroin to be brought in off of oil rigs in the Gulf through boats and operations controlled by Carlos Marcello, the mafia don of New Orleans. And what they would do would be to stash the heroin way down deep underwater on the pilings of the oil platforms, and service boats would go out, and the hard hat divers would go down, pick up the heroin. They'd put it on the service boats, not subject to customs search because they were only going out to service the rig, and the heroin would be brought back in. I saw her arranging for all that to happen. I broke it off with her, came back, tried to save my career, told LAPD everything I'd seen, and of course that only made things worse. I lasted another year. I was earning the highest rating reports possible in LAPD. I was about to be promoted. I'd passed the detective test, had a high oral score, and eventually I was about a week away from being promoted to detective. I had already worked assignments in narcotics on loan. And I was getting death threats, and I was getting followed to and from work, and I was getting burglarized. I'd been shot at once in New Orleans, and I had a tape-recorded death threat. And I sent a copy to Chief Gates asking for help, and the message I got back was, well, the chief's busy. He can see you for 5 or 10 minutes in a week to 10 days. If you're still alive, maybe we can make an appointment. So that's when I resigned. That was November 30th, 1978. Since then, I have not stopped talking about CIA and drugs. In October of '81, I sat in the basement of the West Wing of the White House, then after 3.5 years, in the office of Craig Fuller, who had been my closest friend, who was then assistant to Ed Meese. And I said, CIA is dealing drugs and it's wrong. and I was right underneath Ronnie's butt in the West Wing. And of course, Oliver North was just getting warmed up, so to speak, with the rencontre. I have met almost people from every major news organization, 60 Minutes. They've all been out to talk to me, and of course, I've never gotten a nickel's worth of coverage, except lately. I've done more than 120 radio interviews in the last year. I was on Lou Epton last night, and thank God Peter's gone. Up until last night, Peter was the most friendly talk show host I'd ever been with, but Lou Epton was a lot of fun also. He's a very nice guy. So, the CIA deal drugs. What does that have to do with the impeachment? Well, that's what I write about. That's what I investigate about. That's what I have devoted and given my life to. And I'm going to talk, rather than take you through all of my history, I will tell you that in the last 21 years, I've been shot at twice. I've been homeless for more than 3.5 years. I've been without cars for 4 years. Michael Jackson's marriage lasted longer than mine did. I've been threatened a number of times, again recently. And that's not by way of making it sound like I've gone through all these hard times, because I'm lucky. Because I have documented the cases of people who have been out and out murdered, including Jim Sabo, who was the chief of air operations at El Toro Marine Air Station. He was murdered in 1991. His family and I'm very close to his brother David. There have been a lot of guys who have paid with their lives. So if I'm alive, I guess it's because I'm supposed to be. And I'm grateful for that today, because there are some great opportunities. Now, I'm going to give you a little history shortly, right now, about what happened when the Gary Webb stories broke and what's been happening since, and how all of that ties into the impeachment crisis. But right before I do that, I just want to summarize a few of the things that I've been investigating and researching. This is by way of establishing my credibility, letting you know what I have available for you and the kind of sources that I have. In the August issue of my newsletter, From the Wilderness, I wrote a story on COINTELPRO. I had been seeing a lot of FBI-type COINTELPRO activities in the anti-CIA drug movement. And I started researching COINTELPRO because I was seeing the tactics, I was seeing the provocateurs, I was seeing the divisions. And probably any of you who are active have probably experienced the same kind of frustration, where you're out and you're trying to do some good, and all of a sudden somebody says something that's kind of like what you say, but it's got 25 degrees off and it brings everything to a grinding halt. Or you find somebody coming in doing character assassination, or you find, that's COINTELPRO. In the 60s, the FBI was running close to 35,000 undercover agents, not just FBI agents, but they were informants paid to infiltrate and cause trouble. The primary targets were the Black Panthers and the anti-war movement. Okay? And I started researching this, and I started digging, and there was a Supreme Court case in 1984 called Hobson versus Williams. It wasn't Supreme Court, it went to the appellate court in Washington, D.C., in which top secret FBI documents were unearthed. And the FBI documents from that period revealed the one thing that the government was more afraid of than anything else, and that was an alliance between blacks and whites. The highest priority in the FBI was to prevent any kind of crossover between so-called activists on the left or on the right, or people speaking out against government operations, and anybody talking about civil rights. Now, if you think about it, Martin Luther King was assassinated only immediately after he was a civil rights activist to a point, but then he came out against the Vietnam War. And all of the anti-war people, who were primarily white parents who were losing their sons in Vietnam, started to listen to King, and he was taken out like that. All that's extremely well documented in what I did in the August issue. In July, I wrote a couple of really fun stories. April Oliver of CNN fame, who has become a very good and dear friend of mine. I just did a lengthy show with her on a program hosted by Jeff Rentz. 3 hours I was on. And she wrote these stories on sarin gas, about sarin gas being used to kill defectors in Southeast Asia. And I took that and ran with it because I knew a little bit more about that. And I had spoken to Monica Jensen Stevenson, who wrote a great book on the POWs called Kiss the Boys Goodbye. And one thing I'm very much aware of is that if you go back into Southeast Asia, we left probably 2,000 or more MIAs and POWs in Southeast Asia. Henry Kissinger out and out lied when he said there were no more guys left there after the Paris Peace Accords were signed. And if you look at the history of that, part of that was because we ran a whole war in Laos that was funded by heroin under the directorship of Ted Shackley, who was the station chief in Laos and later Saigon. And you find names like Secord and Singlaub and Armitage. Oliver North actually got his start there. You find all the guys that Bo Greitz talks about, and I know Bo Greitz. You know, I was married in the home of Mrs. Francis Gary Powers, the U-2 pilot. I've been around a while, okay? The same guys responsible for selling out all of our POWs in Southeast Asia are exactly the same people inside CIA who have been trafficking in narcotics. Exactly the same. And that makes the most natural alliance in the world, the alliance between prisoner of war MIA families and the people of South Central Los Angeles. And I'm trying to build that bridge now. I was just at a meeting in South Central last week with a number of African American groups. My death threats recently have come, and I'll tell you straight out, I'm proud of it. I don't care what anybody thinks. I just got the endorsement of 500 black Baptist ministers. Okay? And then within a week I was getting death threats. White supremacists. Okay? I don't care. The truth has no color. So I wrote this story, and I dug up some information on sarin gas, and my hypothesis, and I argue for it here, and I support it, that we not only wanted to kill the deserters, we wanted to kill all the POWs. We didn't want them to come home because they were evidence of what we had done. And I also believe that many of the POWs we left were a form of deniable, plausibly deniable economic assistance to the North Vietnamese and to the Soviet Union. They called it mana from Lenin when the EWOs and the back seats from the back seats of F-4s were taken to Moscow. And I do believe some MIAs have been brought back that we don't know about. Okay, but I interviewed another former Green Beanie, and God, I love my Green Beanies, and I pick on them whenever Tim's around. Sorry, Tim. But I interviewed once a former Special Forces captain who in '68 was ordered into the Central Highlands of Vietnam. And he took his special action team up into the Central Highlands of Vietnam and rendezvoused with Russian Spetsnaz commandos. Now, the Spetsnaz are the counterpart to the Green Berets. And he traded millions of dollars in hard U.S. currency to the Spetsnaz in exchange for Russian diamonds at the peak of the Vietnam War. Why? Because the Russian economy was failing. They needed foreign currency to keep their economy alive so that they could keep building tanks to supply and SAMs to supply the North Vietnamese, because what we really wanted to do was to keep the war going. Now, I heard some people talk about Brown Brothers Harriman earlier. It should be no surprise to anybody that George Herbert Walker Bush's father, Prescott, and Averell Harriman founded a company called Brown Brothers Harriman, which in conjunction with the Rockefellers and Henry Ford and Standard Oil financed I.G. Farben and Adolf Hitler. Okay? War is a business. That's why I'm not too terribly afraid of any enemy they cock up against us and try to make us afraid so we have to spend billions of dollars. There are two books I have read which explain to me now. You got to remember, I've been at this 21 years. I have 25,000 pages of notes. I have a library that's probably more than 200 books, and there's still more I want to read. Two books out of all the years that I've been at this explain what's going on to me more than anything else. The first is The Secret Team by L. Fletcher Prouty.
The Secret Team?
The Secret Team by L. Fletcher Prouty. It's very hard to find. The second is The Report from Iron Mountain by Leonard Lewin. Okay? And I do not believe Iron Mountain to be fiction. So anyway, as a result of this story, I hooked up with April Oliver, and we've been sharing notes. And April Oliver, you're going to hear more from her. You might have seen the 4-part series in TV Guide that just ran on her. It was a pretty good story. In the October issue, and now we're getting warm so that I don't have to keep you all in suspense about the impeachment, I wrote, we had been waiting for Volume 2 of the CIA's Inspector General report, and I'll save that, and I thoroughly broke that down. I want to back up 1 second. I also broke a story in August about how we had given a whole bunch of Huey helicopters to the Mexican government to fight drugs. Bill Clinton did. I think it was 76 Bell UH-1s that we sent them to go fight the drug trade, and I broke a story nobody else broke. Do you know who was in charge of delivering the helicopters for the United States government? A guy by the name of Felix Rodriguez, Oliver North's best friend. They were staged in Belize, where former DDO of CIA Carl Jenkins used to own a helicopter repair maintenance facility. Belize is right next to Chiapas, and there are no drugs in Chiapas. We were gearing up for the next war. That's at the same time that my friend John Carmen, a customs inspector, was telling me about these sealed containers coming in through Costco from China that were being shipped straight through the border without any inspections on their way to Chiapas, and of course many of us believe they were full of AK-47s. Ted Shackley wrote a book, this is probably my third most revealing book, called The Third Option, which is damn near impossible to find, in which he said sometimes the best thing to do and the only thing to do is arm both sides in a conflict. And that's what the agency does. I broke that story. And in December, last month, I'm really proud of this. I broke a large story. You can see that's a picture of a C-130. And boy, have I got documents on this. I broke a story about how going back to about 1987-88, the Central Intelligence Agency, which by the way had been caught by the Church Committee using the Forest Service and the Postal Service as a cover, was moving C-130 Hercules into the Forest Service, supposedly so that the Forest Service could give them to private air contractors, such as T&G and Hemet Valley Flying Service and several others that I write about, so that they could be converted into air tankers to fight forest fires. Now, we already knew that CIA used the Forest Service. That came out in the Church Committee hearings. But what started in 87 was 28 of these C-130s. They're worth about $3.5, $4 million apiece. One prop and one engine is worth $100,000. We were giving them to these private contractors, all of whom were like CIA proprietaries or contractors, to be converted to air tankers. And where did they go? Well, they've been caught in Kuwait. They've been caught in Angola. They've been caught in South Africa. They've been caught in Israel. They've been caught in France. They've been caught in Spain. And in 1996 and 97, one was caught in Mexico City, Aeropostal de Mexico, with about 4,000 kilos of cocaine. One was caught with Translatin Air in Panama with about the same size load. One of them resulted in major indictments in Chicago and conviction. And two guys actually went to prison, one guy named Roy Reagan and another guy named Fred Fox, because we've proven, and one really good whistleblower, Gary Idle, has absolutely proven, I mean, I've got the documents I wrote about him, that CIA has been laundering these out through Evergreen, their largest proprietary, and Evergreen was doing all the maintenance on these. And they're still flying drugs to this day. CIA has never stopped flying or moving drugs in its 50 years of existence. Read you one short paragraph. This is a U.S. Forest Service document. Again, this is in my December issue. This is to George Leonard, Associate Chief of the Forest Service, from Kenneth Cohen, Assistant General Counsel. And in the last paragraph of this memorandum, dated 1989, it says the Forest Service has now assumed the role of intermediary, apparently at the suggestion of Department of Defense. DoD transfers excess aircraft to the Forest Service via the General Services Administration. The Forest Service transfers the aircraft to an air tanker contractor in exchange for an historic aircraft. They take the old pieces of junk back. The Forest Service then donates the historic aircraft to a museum. Apparently, DoD, that's Department of Defense, thinks that by having the Forest Service as the intermediary, if any future aircraft are used in drug smuggling, the Forest Service and not DoD will suffer the adverse publicity. A U.S. government document. Okay, only in my newsletter. All right. Now I'm laying out a canvas for you, so that when we get to the final pieces of the picture here, hopefully it will produce like the biggest aha I've heard. And boy, whenever I've laid this out, I get some huge ahas. The brief history of CIA, let's go back to World War II, Office of Strategic Services. Our first link up between CIA or the government, intelligence, and the mafia was when we sprang Vito Genovese from prison in 1943 with the help of Lucky Luciano. We incorporated them both. By the way, Lucky Luciano, who was in Dannemora prison, do you know where he was when he was arrested before he went into prison? A little town called Warm Springs, Arkansas. About 35 miles up the road from Mena. And by the way, Gary Idle, a former CIA pilot, whose credentials are absolutely impeccable. He's testified in Congress. He's become a very dear friend of mine. Testified in U.S. versus Reagan, Roy Reagan, that the CIA was flying drugs into Mena as far back as 1972 to 75. I'm putting things in context for you. so that you will be able to draw your own conclusions. Thomas Jefferson said, "I firmly believe that a free people armed with the right information will always come to the right decision. The only problem is you got to get the right information, you know." So we let Vito Genovese out of prison in '43, and he went into Sicily, and he opened the way for Patton. Now, during the Second World War, due to the blockade around the United States for German U-boats, U.S. heroin addict population had dropped by about 40%. Why? You couldn't get the heroin in because the Navy was looking for the U-boats. Soon as we got Vito Genovese back into Italy, set him up with the civil affairs authorities of the U.S. Army and OSS, by 1945, before the war was even over, the heroin addict population in this country had gone back up to pre-war levels and exceeded pre-war levels. Thank you, Vito Genovese. Okay. Right after World War II, Luciano got out. We used the Sicilian Mafia and the OSS to crush all of the labor unions and all of the labor movements and the socialists and the commies and all of those bad people. We used the Mafia to crush all of them in southern France and in Italy because labor unions and the socialists were almost going to win elections. So we funded the whole thing with heroin, which was the genesis of the French Connection and the OSS, and we crushed any opposition to right-wing CIA-supported governments from '48 all the way up through the early '50s. It's well documented. Okay. Then we go into Southeast Asia, and probably many of you are familiar with this. I'll do it quickly. After Dien Bien Phu, and actually before, we had an airline called Civil Air Transport, which evolved into an airline called Air America. We took over an operation the French called Project X, which was how they were funding the war with heroin out of the Golden Triangle. We sent a guy named Ed Lansdale into Southeast Asia with the Military Assistance and Advisory Group. We sent a lot of people in there, and we took right over and we expanded the opium trade, and we funded a whole war in Laos. We ran millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars out of Laos. I interviewed a guy for an article I wrote on the sarin gas stories who was with Air America, and he used to fly to Site 85 in Laos, which was overrun in 1968. And I think 11 live Americans were taken out of Site 85, which the government still denies, but one of them has come back. And his quote to me was, as you flew into Site 85, which was a CIA site, you would see nothing but opium poppies stretching out for miles. And then he said, well, sure, we were briefed on opium, that we were flying opium and heroin. We were told it was all for pharmaceutical purposes. You know, and then I had to make the point to him that the volume they were moving could have probably supplied the world with medicinal morphine for about 50 years, you know, and that's just in about 10 flights. Okay, so we did it all through Vietnam. The same guys leave Vietnam in 1975. Saigon fell in April '75. And then we sent them to Iran and Iraq. That's where Secord went. That's where Helms went. And immediately we started creating the whole situation, the whole war scenario for spending in Iran and Iraq. And we started arming the Kurds to fight Saddam Hussein. And then we had Pakistan, and a real brief note there. In 1979, pre the Soviet invasion of Pakistan, 0% of the heroin entering the United States was coming from Pakistan. Russians invade in 79, 80, we have a massive buildup. And by the way, one of the guys that we created to fight the Russians, and I've seen CIA reports on this, it's extremely well documented, under the Afghan leader Hekmatyar, was this other guy named Osama bin Laden, who got all of his training from the CIA. Okay, and Hekmatyar controlled the 6 largest heroin refineries in all of Pakistan. By 1982-83, 50 to 60% of the heroin entering the country is coming from Pakistan on CIA-approved and controlled missions. All right? All right, so that's the history. Then we get to beautiful downtown Iran-Contra. All right? Now, I'll stop there. You should all, I hope you all remember the Gary Webb stories from the San Jose Mercury News of August '96. This reporter, and I was talking to Gary yesterday. I mean, you know, he subscribes to my newsletter and we communicate frequently. And he comes across this story. This lady named Coral Baca shows up on his doorstep, virtually, she calls him, in the summer of '95. She's got all these great documents. about how her boyfriend, Rafael Cornejo, who worked for a guy, Danilo Blandon, was being held in prison for like 2.5 years without even having had a trial. And he was connected to this guy named Blandon and Meneses, and they were all working for the CIA. And she had grand jury transcripts, which, if you know anything about it, it's not easy to get federal grand jury transcripts, but she had them. That started the Gary Webb investigation. And of course, we all know Gary Webb was right. Okay, and we also saw what happened to him. So we had this big series in the San Jose Mercury News, which immediately the press and the CIA infiltrated press. And here's one other piece I'll give you that ought to open your eyes a little bit if you don't know it already. In 1985, the American Broadcasting Company was purchased by a company called Capital Cities Broadcasting. Remember that? What had been going on was ABC had been doing a large expose of a CIA scandal in Hawaii called BBRDW, Bishop Baldwin, Rewald, Dillingham, and Wong. Boy, I have to be sober to say that, don't I? Peter Jennings had been right up on that, and he was kicking some CIA butt, and then all of a sudden Cap Cities bought CIA. Do you know who the chief counsel for Capital Cities Broadcasting was? William Casey, Ronald Reagan's director of Central Intelligence. Do you know who owns NBC? General Electric. I haven't heard about that, but GE owns it by title. Did you know who owns CBS? Westinghouse, the third largest defense contractor. Henry Kissinger sits on the board at Washington Post Newsweek. Okay? All right, so that's the backstory. So Gary Webb breaks these great stories, and we have this outrage, and all of a sudden, now, for me, when the Webb stories broke, here I've been out here in 1996, it had been for 18 years. And I couldn't get anybody to pay attention. I'd been in the White House, I'd met the 60 Minutes people, I'd met some of the biggest names. It's great, we're going to do a story on this, and a week later you call them, who? Never heard of you before. And there was all this outrage. And then the CIA director came to Watts. Now, what the CIA director did was he said, we're going to get to the bottom of this. We're going to tell you, the American people, the truth. Yes, sir, my yumpin' Yemeni. Of course, he was like that the whole time. Well, the CIA separated their investigation into two parts. Volume 1 was focused only on Iran-Contra in Los Angeles. They called it the Los Angeles Connection. Now, right after I confronted John Deutsch, I had been burglarized. I wasn't going to go there, but I had original White House letters in my house, and they were stolen from my residence while I slept 3 days after I confronted John Deutsch. The LAPD still has an active investigation on that. They came up with fingerprints, and they just can't get around to running that supercomputer to find out who they belong to. But the Senate and the House flew investigators out who spent, each team spent a day with me, took all the documents I had with me at the moment, and of course, I've learned you don't keep all your documents in one place, but I shared with them in a most generous and spiritual manner the documents I had. And in Volume 1, the CIA said, no evidence of drug dealing. And they put all these statements in there that I had made. The funny thing was they never interviewed me, which I thought was kind of cute, that Mike Ruppert told us this and Mike Ruppert told us that. And they called me one day and I said, I'll be happy to talk to you. I want to have a lawyer and a tape recorder. And they said, we'll get back to you. And I never heard from them. And then all of a sudden my interview statements turned up in the CIA Volume 1. Now, CIA Volume 1 was, how do I describe this? CIA Volume 1 on its face said, no evidence. And there was probably 10, 15 pages of summaries, which said we found no evidence of this, no evidence of that. But it's about 300 pages long, 400 pages. If you read the whole thing, you get down in there and you say, well, wait a minute, this confirms what Webb said. Well, this puts Adolfo Calero in touch with Enrique Bermudez, handling the cocaine in touch with Meneses. So you found little confirmations. Now, the Department of Justice did their own investigation, which came out later. Now, the mechanics of this, now pay careful attention, because now we're starting to weave into the impeachment and how it's going to play in the impeachment. The mechanics of this is the CIA has an inspector general who's supposed to be independent. At the time was a guy named Frederick P. Hitz. Hitz did the investigations. Hitz prepares Volume 1 and Volume 2, and they have to be submitted to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and to the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, HPSI as we call it. And then the congressional committees have to review the report, accept it, reject it, or conduct their investigation and say they're satisfied. So it ain't through until Congress says it's through. Okay? Volume 1 came out, and what CIA wanted to do with Volume 1, I was on the phone March 15th with Maxine Waters' staff in Washington. I'm saying, when are we ever going to have hearings? And I'm talking to her aide, Mike Schmitz, and Mike says, can I say a bad word on tape? He says, holy shit, they're starting the hearings right now. Turn on C-SPAN. We got to get out of here. We're on our way over. Click. So I rush and turn on C-SPAN, and about 5 minutes later, you see Maxine and her aide storming into the House Intelligence Committee room, and she gets to testify, and she basically tore CIA up one side and down the other with their own words. She was like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. It was great. The chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, is a guy named Porter Goss, Republican of Florida. Porter Goss is a retired case officer from the Central Intelligence Agency who worked with Ted Shackley in the Miami station. Okay? All right, so that was Volume 1. Now, of course, you never heard about it, so we said, this ain't going to happen to us. When we have hearings on Volume 2, we're going to make sure that some press is there. We're going to make sure we have some advance notice. We're going to make sure the right witnesses are called. Now, what happened right after Volume 1 was released was suddenly, out of nowhere, and nobody can figure out how this happened. I'm going to tell you how I believe it happened. This memorandum turns up. It just shows up in Maxine Waters' office. Now, what I have here in my hand, and these are available for sale, these are extracts from Volume 2. Volume 2 is 440 pages, about 440. And I have extracted the 44 most damning pages of the CIA's own words. These are their paragraph numbers, these are quotes. I've put in some notes, but if you need, there is no longer any need to doubt. This is enough to put CIA, Oliver North especially, in jail right now. We'll get to that in a minute. This memorandum turns up with Maxine Waters, and it's a memorandum. I'm going to get your attention. I'm going to love this. It's a memorandum between William French Smith, who was Ronald Reagan's Attorney General, and William Casey, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, periodically, Department of Justice and CIA enter into negotiations for what's called an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, because by law, CIA is required to report crimes by its employees and its non-employees to Department of Justice. CIA is, in other words, required to tell the FBI or DEA when one of its employees violates passport regulations, engages in smuggling, forges a document, misappropriates his expense account. These are all codified in an MOU. Well, over a period of 6 months, in 1982, they renegotiated the whole MOU, and the first thing they did was they took all of these categories of people who were once known as employees. That's agents, CIA agents, not case officers, but agents, contractors, informants, assets, anything else, and all of a sudden, by the stroke of a pen, Bill Casey says, these are now non-employees as far as this MOU is concerned. CIA might well be paying their paycheck, but they're no longer employees. Then, after 6 months of negotiations, in this letter, I'll just read you the exact quote. In light of these provisions, and in view of the fine cooperation the Drug Enforcement Administration has received from CIA, no formal requirement regarding the reporting of narcotics violations has been included in these procedures. We look forward to CIA's continuing cooperation with the Department of Justice in this area. By the stroke of a pen, it was no longer necessary for CIA to tell anybody when its agents, assets, informants, contractors, proprietary airlines were dealing drugs. Guess who wrote the memorandum? Ken Starr. Ken Starr. Oh, you got it. Okay. Now, here's what I know. Here's what I know. About 6 months ago, a good friend of mine, Dan Hopsicker, a former news producer here in Los Angeles who has a large web page, reported Ken Starr wrote the memo, and I checked, and Bob Perry, the former AP reporter who helped break the Contra drug stories back in '86, had reported the same thing, and I independently have confirmed by going back through the confirmation hearings for the independent counsel, which are available on the web, Ken Starr's testimony, that he was a part of the special assistant staff to Attorney General William French Smith, which negotiated this memorandum. Ken Starr, okay? Boy, I got your attention now, don't I? Okay. So, we knew that Volume 2 was going to be real hairy. We knew that Volume 2 was going to have to tell us something because why? First of all, we had the Kerry Committee report from 10 years ago, and Senator John Kerry, one of those nasty old Democrats, had done a bang-up job of dragging out a lot of information about CIA being up to its eyeballs in drugs. As a matter of fact, John Kerry had dug up so much information that any honest prosecutor would have wanted to issue indictments right away for people like Oliver North and John Poindexter and George Bush. And George Bush was up to his eyeballs in the whole thing. Okay? The unspoken message here is that the Democrats are saying, we let you all off in Iran-Contra for all this drug dealing, so what if Bill Clinton's doing a little Monica Lewinsky and a little missile technology and a little fundraising with the Lippo group and a little of this and murdering Ron Brown? We let you off. Now you begin to understand some of the energy that's going on here that's not being spoken. And I'm going to expand on this in just a minute. And get ready to say, aha, okay? Volume 2 was delivered in a classified version to the House and the Senate Intelligence Committees last May. There have been no hearings on Volume 2. What we have been waiting for was a declassified version for the human beings like you and me to be able to read. The task of declassifying Volume 2 didn't rest with the House. The task of declassifying Volume 2 for public consumption rested with the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, George Tenet. Now, here's your civics quiz for the day. Who appointed George Tenet? Bill Clinton. He's a Clinton appointee. He works directly for Bill Clinton. Okay? Now, a little history in case you all didn't know, Bill Clinton was up to his eyeballs in cocaine in Mena, Arkansas. But here's a mistake, and I almost want to throw a bucket of cold water on people when they act like Bill Clinton is the original devil in the universe. Bill Clinton didn't invent cocaine smuggling by the CIA, and removing him from office is not going to end it. As governor of Arkansas, he could not have orchestrated the Central Intelligence Agency, the Marines, the South Florida Task Force, the Customs, the Justice Department. William Weld was up to his eyeballs in protecting Oliver North. That's why Bill Clinton wanted him to be the ambassador to Mexico. William Weld stopped every investigation into Iran-Contra drug trafficking when he was Assistant Attorney General for Criminal. And then Bill Clinton wants to make him ambassador to Mexico. But Bill Clinton didn't start it. Check your history again. Who was the first person to introduce Bill Clinton into Washington circles in 1991 as a potential presidential candidate? Pamela Harriman, the widow of Averill Harriman, who founded Brown Brothers Harriman with George Herbert Walker Bush's father, Prescott Bush. One of the first and largest campaign contributors to Bill Clinton was a guy named Jackson Stevens. Now, Jack Stevens is a Little Rock billionaire, but Jackson Stevens, whose company Systematics handles about 70% of your banking transactions through his software, has been a lifelong friend of George Bush. You check the campaign records, he was funding George Bush, and then all of a sudden he's funding Bill Clinton. We're talking two sides of the same coin. Now, bear in mind, and this is where I have some disagreement with the Democrats who would say that Bill Clinton is the lesser of two evils. And I do think that George Bush represents a greater evil. And I can give you two reasons for that. George W. and Jeb, who now govern 18% of the American people. George Bush has been CIA his whole life. He was the director of Central Intelligence when I got exposed to CIA dealing drugs. And we can prove that he ran the cocaine operations in Iran-Contra. Okay? But my point is this: when you argue for the lesser of two evils, you're still arguing for evil. Okay? Now we're getting ready for the big punchline. I'm sitting here with Volume 2 in my hand, and when this first comes out, I call my friend Celerino Castillo. He was a DEA agent who was watching the planes full of cocaine leave hangars 4 and 5 at Ilopango in El Salvador. And we read this and we say to ourselves, my God, it's a confession. Now, let me take just 1 second to read you an example of what's in these extracts. All right? I go to paragraph 490. Now, there's a brief backstory to this, very brief. One of the major drug dealing outfits in the Contra War was an outfit called Frigoríficos de Punta Arenas. Say that 3 times real fast. It was a shrimp company. While they were listed as a Class 1 DEA violator, they were receiving State Department subsidies, thanks to Oliver North and Elliott Abrams, to the tune of about $400,000 or $500,000. In other words, we were subsidizing a drug dealer. That was on record, okay? The guy who owned that company was a guy named Moises Núñez. Núñez was caught in '85 with 400 pounds of cocaine. Got sloppy. That was just one of his many runs. Paragraph 490 of the Inspector General's report. On March 25, 1987, CIA questioned Núñez about narcotics trafficking allegations against him. Núñez revealed that since 1985, he had engaged in a clandestine relationship with the National Security Council. Who's he talking about? Oliver North. Núñez refused to elaborate on the nature of these actions, but indicated it was difficult to answer questions relating to his involvement in narcotics trafficking because of the specific tasks he had performed at the direction of the NSC. Núñez just copped out to dealing drugs for Oliver North. CIA reports, not Gary Webb or Mike Ruppert anymore, CIA saying it. Núñez refused to identify the NSC officials with whom he had been involved. Paragraph 491. Headquarters cabled in April 1987 that a decision had been made to debrief Núñez regarding revelations he had made. The next day, however, a headquarters cable stated that, quote, headquarters had decided against debriefing Núñez. The cable offered no explanation for the decision. If you read further here, it talks about a firm called Setco, and Setco was hugely involved. It was owned by a guy named Mara Ballesteros, who was moving like 4 tons of cocaine a month. And CIA lays out that Setco was moving its money through, quote, bank accounts established by Oliver North. Volume 2. Page after page. I've got 44 pages of stuff. You read this and you say, we don't need to get anybody to prove anything anymore. We have it. It's right here. It's right here. Of course, we've been having this little problem with Monica Lewinsky's sexual habits, which have distracted us, and you haven't heard about this, have you? But I have, okay? And a lot of other people have. So here are the confessions, and I encourage you to get these tonight. They're all, you know, I'm selling for a little over cost, $13. Okay, but you read this because you don't need any more proof to bring this whole damned government to a halt. If we can get the floor, and we can. It's right here. Okay. So now we're in a situation where Volume 2 is in. It's sitting in the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, which are controlled by Republicans. But Bill Clinton has the DCI, who's going to release the declassified version. This declassified version, guess when this was released? The Central Intelligence Agency posted on the internet Volume 2 with all of these revelations 1 hour after Henry Hyde's committee voted to start the impeachment inquiry. 1 hour. Now, do you get the unspoken message here? I happen to be a guy who thinks that Bill Clinton has kind of a weird personality, but what I believe Bill Clinton is saying, you impeach me, you remove me from office, I'll turn on everybody and I'll jump on the pulpit and I'll bring down the whole damn government. Do it. Do it. Do it. Okay? These boys are standing in gasoline up to here, and they're playing chicken with matches. And well, can somebody please go knock into one of them and make them drop the match? Okay? That's really my belief. I don't want this to get traded. This is my life. I put 21 years into this. I never had kids because I was told if I ever had kids, they'd be killed. I don't want this to be traded for anybody or anything. I don't want Bill Clinton to trade it off to save his ass. And you're looking now and you're thinking, you watch how this impeachment circus is unfolding. And, you know, first it looked like they didn't have him, then they had him. No, they're not going to get him. No, they're going to get him. Maybe it's a great drama, but I think he's forcing him into maybe cutting a deal. But they still have to have a hearing on this. Now, through my newsletter and my website address is on the flyer back up there, www.copvcia.com. I've got all the hot links where you can email Congress. And you can email ABC and NBC and CBS and the Washington Post and the New York Times, and you can say, I want cameras and I want reporters in those hearings, and I want a full witness list with Mike Ruppert and Celerino Castillo and Mike Levine and Terry Reid, and I want everybody in that room, and I want you to talk about this. And the House Intelligence Committee has received, you know, that means somebody watches what I do, more than 500 letters already. Okay? My website's been visited by 15,000 plus people from 50 countries just since April, so I'm doing all right there. Still broke, but I'm doing all right. I'm sorry? Oh, of course, www.copvcia.com. Just think Roe v. Wade, but think CopVCIA, and that's my site, .com. www.copvcia.com. Okay. All right, now let me sweeten this up a little bit. So I came up with this brainstorm. And I said, my God, that makes sense. Everything makes sense. Everything fits. That's what the son of a gun's doing. He had George Tenet release this an hour afterwards. He's holding this as a boom against the Republicans. That's the way these boys play. Now, was there any indication that maybe this has been set in motion? And this is something I want you all to bear in mind because it may help you to understand other stuff about the way CIA works. CIA works on 5 and 10 and 20-year plans to overthrow and destabilize governments, to create leaders. They do not work spur of the moment. They set forces in motion 5, 10 years ahead of time. I saw a memorandum about a secret briefing at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran conducted by CIA in 1978 for Ronald Reagan, George Bush, and Margaret Thatcher at a point of time when not one of them held an elected office. Okay? So I said, all right, Ken Starr was appointed independent counsel in 1994. Remember, he has a connection to CIA, doesn't he? Coral Baca showed up at Gary Webb's doorstep with these documents in the summer of '95. I did some checking. Coral Baca had called me herself. As of last summer, she was engaged to marry Carlos Lader. Carlos Lader was the number 3 guy in the Medellin cartel. Carlos Lader was the guy George Bush put in prison and made testify against Manuel Noriega. Carlos Lader was with the Medellin, and the Medellin cartel was overthrown by George Bush in favor of the Cali cartel at the end of the Contra War. Now, Lader's out of prison now. Do you think he has a motive for revenge against George Bush? So it's fitting. I mean, you know, I absolutely am convinced this is what's going on. Now, let me tell you a little background before we go to questions. In this kind of environment, you kind of get the feel as you understand what's going on. And I don't write about in my newsletter or anything else that I write about unless it's something that I have documents on, or I have read the documents and have the documents, or I have interviewed a witness, or I have sources. I don't speculate. Okay? Speculate is thought, and I do think a lot about stuff to analyze, but I don't write about stuff. I'm an investigator by nature. Okay? So I heard some stuff about the Illuminati, and I hear about that, but I've never spoken to anybody in the Illuminati. I've never spoken to the Queen of England, but I can tell you where my research has taken me. And it's not to diminish anybody else's work. It's just what I do, because I do a lot of radio, and I can get sued. This is kind of like the gods on Olympus are having this big battle, and us little peons down here